Righteous Russia, Part 7. Power. At its apex, and before the seemingly inevitable decline that appears to be the fate of nearly all once great IP in the modern entertainment zeitgeist, Game of Thrones was one of the most intelligent pieces of genre fare ever to be put to screen, big or small. Beneath the epic fantasy lore and the medieval European window dressing and supporting the stellar work done by the original cast in the HBO adaptation, Game of Thrones excelled because of its deftly written, complex, and realistic source material. As I have taken a hiatus from the Righteous Russia series, partially due to health reasons and partially to bring the series into its home stretch with a unified vision, one scene from this all-timer has continued to pop into my head over and over again as I observe Vladimir Putin's once cagey and now bold stare down with his enemies in the once unified West. In it, we're treated to the same setup that later became a trope of Thrones. That being a twisting, turning, clever exchange of verbal ripostes, threats, and counters between two intelligent characters attempting to wield his or her political influence. But one exchange in particular reminds me of the current standoff we're seeing play out on the world stage between Vladimir Putin, backed by the near limitless potential, both military and otherwise, of Mother Russia, and the combined and largely overstated memory of might, best represented by the shadows of the European Union, the seat of deep state, non-power. Cersei Lannister is one of Game of Thrones' most reviled and beloved characters. She is conniving, hateful, and spiteful, with a tongue at times silver and honeyed, and at others barbed, as only twisted wire could be, and forked like a serpent's. While Cersei usually gets what she wants out of a verbal exchange when dealing with the more straightforward, militarily minded, and honorable characters in the series, an early scene has her exchanging gilded threats with the court whisperer of her family's kingdom, that being Peter Baelish, best known as Littlefinger, a master of coin, accountant, and member of the small council, then an advisor to her husband, the king of the Seven Kingdoms, and an exceedingly clever man. While Cersei is undoubtedly a villain in Game of Thrones, if a compelling one, in this conversation, she reminds me most directly of Putin, whom I have put forth as something as close to an anti-globalist hero as we have in times such as these, though it has put me in a minority camp in some circles. You see, there are very few scenes in Game of Thrones wherein Littlefinger is left at a loss for words directly after one of his trademarked threats of blackmail. Prominent families often forget a simple truth I've found, Littlefinger says with a smirk after refusing a favor of the queen. And which truth is that? A tense Cersei responds, knowledge is power. When Littlefinger steps out of line and seemingly wins the battle of wits in the moment by not so subtly threatening to expose her darkest secrets to the kingdom at large, Cersei, flanked by her ever-present royal guards, pauses briefly, tosses her hair back, and utters two simple words. "Seize him," she says, and then follows it up with three more. "Cut his throat." The panic that washes Littlefinger's face as the cold steel, still ringing after having been freed of its scabbard, greets the bare skin of his throat is something readers and viewers have not seen up to this point in the story. But just before the guard does Cersei's bidding and spills Littlefinger's clever blood, onto the clever cobblestones, Cersei says somewhat nonchalantly, "Oh, wait, I've changed my mind. Let him go." The guards do as she commands. Step back 3 paces, and they do. Turn around, close your eyes. When the guards step back from a shivering Littlefinger, whose shocked eyes take some time in switching from them to the true threat in the courtyard, that being Cersei herself, the game is up. He has lost, and she has won. And before Cersei makes her way from the courtyard with her violent, utterly obedient retinue in tow, she glides up to Peter Baelish, the master of coin, and whispers the final 3 words of the exchange and one of the best lines in fiction. Power is power. Cersei has won this exchange not by outthinking the man nor by confusing him. No, Cersei simply reminds Littlefinger that no matter how clever a man or woman is in a world such as theirs, the side that wins the game is the side that possesses the most power. Which brings us to the 2 sides engaging in the Euro-Russian front in this multi-front war, one with power and one with only the appearance of power. And if you had any doubt as to which was which or who was who when it comes to Russia and the European Union, I hope the series thus far has helped to illuminate that. Alas, let me shed a little more light on the proceedings. If Vladimir Putin has grown more bold in his messaging, I think it's safe for us to do the same. In an earlier entry in this series, I warned that one must not flinch in the face of an advancing tiger, and I will argue here that the European Union and all the dark subterfuge that bureaucratic abomination represents have done just that. Not in the field, nor even in the media they wield with increasing desperation, but rather in ledgers, which carry the weight of the world. The European Union, the controllers, have flinched in the same way Peter Baelish flinched in his exchange with the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. However, while the reactions of Littlefinger and his real-world counterparts share an aesthetic, they differ in the threat that prompted it. In the aforementioned scenario, Cersei's definition of power is fairly literal. Baelish has threatened her with information, with influence, while she responds with one of violence, a promise to kill. Now, you might argue that Vladimir Putin has done the same with the globalist deep state, fielding a highly trained military force in the Nazi-infected proxy state that is Ukraine. But that conflict has already approached its ending, as media reports are finally starting to admit. And Putin and Russia are feeling confident enough to leave the subtlety aside as they reveal the true power they mean to wield against their would-be enslavers in the West. Is there a version of power, then, that is even more literal than violence, than force? How about the definition of power itself, at least in the modern vernacular? What if we transition from thoughts of war to thoughts of industry? What is more powerful than power itself? What is power, if not energy? How can a nation wield power if there is nothing underlying it? How can violence be actioned or fielded without the black blood of the earth, keeping it all in perpetual motion? Oil is the blood of empires, and Russia has quite a bit of it, while the European Union decidedly does not. We've seen the media spin Putin's threats to withhold energy from self-described enemies of Russia as empty bluffs. While the corrupt West threatened and then actioned sanctions that ultimately proved toothless, Russia has unfurled its mighty claws to reveal the source of its strength, the beast itself. Russia's power is inherent in its land, in its peoples, and most importantly, in the way Putin and his government have propped it all up, not on fiat currency, threats and favors and exponentially escalating speculation, but on fundamental value, on oil and gas and everything an empire needs to run and a people need to thrive. In an attempt to strangle the Russian economy, the EU has simply shone a light onto the baseless, speculative, collective bubble that the IMF has gilded in fool's gold in the form of numbers on screens, contracts that cannot be enforced, and threats that cannot be actioned. In trying to wield their fiscal might against Russia, they have prompted a measured, gloriously ruthless response, accelerating already rampant inflation, scarcity of both food and resources, and overall hardship for their own peoples. Putin has referred to this boomerang effect as the economic suicide of the West. But before you get too worried about the potential endgame at play here and how it will affect the common man in the US and abroad in the long term, know that we will be discussing the future Putin and Trump and those like them in vision in our next feature. For now, ruminate on the implications of the stranglehold Russia's energy grip on the EU has on international sovereignty. Have you ever heard of the Hegelian dialectic? It is also known as the problem-reaction-solution theorem, which may be its more common name in the current mind war. A favorite psychological tactic of our collective enemy, this concept, broadly defined, refers to the deep state's predilection for reverse engineering a pathway toward a desired end goal, this being the solution in the aforementioned dialectic. Only this is not a solution for us peons and peasants, but a solution for our would-be controllers. Now, the powers that would be are not so stupid as Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have made them appear in recent years. They know that they cannot simply force humanity into a desired pathway if said pathway is contrary to their self-interest. Enter the problem aspect of the dialectic, followed by the reaction, both of which are introduced and coordinated by the military, intelligence, and media industrial complexes of a variety of modern first world nations, including our own. This dialectic could be seen as the most common, insidious, and, to give credit where it is grudgingly due, effective mass psychological weapon of the deep state. In effect, the key to wielding the Hegelian dialectic against otherwise moralistic populations is to be effective storytellers. That said, as I have argued before, the practice can and has been turned around on them by better storytellers. In a previous entry in this series, I referred to Boromir of Gondor, the tragic son of a noble house in J.R.R. Tolkien's classic masterwork, The Lord of the Rings. In an iconic scene many of you are no doubt aware of, Boromir asks why they cannot wield the weapon of the enemy against him. He is rebuked with wise words from wise men. But I say there is a time and a place for this tactic, and we're seeing the beginnings of it play out on the board of Putin's making right now. What if, just as the Hegelian dialectic relies on reverse engineering a problem and reaction toward a desired solution, the Hegelian dialectic was reverse engineered itself? What if the tactic was used against the controllers? And what if, in the place of mere clever storytelling and media posturing, the bedrock holding Putin's dialectic all up comes back around to that fundamental key to winning a war. Power. You've seen the headlines and the counter headlines, the threats and the counter threats, as the EU has called Putin's bluff on energy and been thoroughly routed by his repeated calls and his steadfast resolve in the face of their sanctions, sanctioned he, with the help of Trump and other sovereign leaders in the new world we cannot yet see, already defanged before the deep state attempted to bite. In the next part of our series, we'll go in depth as to the capper to Putin's dialectic as I see it, that being the solution he has in mind, both for the deep state controllers and for us. But for now, I will leave you with twin sets of problems and reactions to consider. First, from the deep state, and second, from Putin and Russia. At the public start of all this madness in Ukraine, before stories of ghosts in Kiev and blockades in Mariupol, sieges of steel and flights of cowardice masquerading as refugees, the mouthpieces of the globalist cabal offered us, as the collective West, a simple problem. Vladimir Putin, with Russia behind him. Then they offered a simple reaction. Panic and fearmonger. Then wield the collective might of the petrodollar and the combined accounting of all the banking nations in concert against the surly tiger, grown too bold in its frosted chains. At least, on the first count, the deep state and Vladimir Putin seem to see eye to eye. Vladimir is the problem. He is a problem for the deep state because he knows them, more so because he knows how to think like them, and now how to fight like them. The only problem for the deep state, something they have been realizing from Poland to Royal England, where the pipelines have gone from surging to lurching, and where the citizenry has gone from rallying to enduring that which Putin has refused to provide in the face of such wanton corruption, they have failed to consider that the reaction Putin has in mind for them is not simply to wield a narrative. Instead, Putin has chosen to wield the truest form of power there is, thus exposing their very lack of it. By embracing the role of the villain that he has been cast in, he has exposed the utter weakness of the would-be heroes of the West as he slowly, unerringly deprives the deep state nations of the blood of his homeland, rich black blood that has powered the very machines of industry. War and everything in between they would seek to wield against him now. But more importantly than the literal effect this deprivation has had on the controllers in the European Union is the psychological effect it has had all the way across the Atlantic and the Pacific, as the collective empire that is globalism incarnate has no clothes. In calling Vladimir Putin's bluff, the deep state has triggered a counter-dialectic to shatter their own and exposed themselves in the process. In seeking to cast Putin as enemy, they have revealed themselves to their collective populaces. They have revealed themselves as aggressors, as attackers, and most importantly, as weak, as the tiger has ignored their threats and carried on in his confident strength, teeth still white and gleaming, and ready for a fight that will never come because he has already won it. It will take time before the last claim is rendered real on our timeline, but rest assured, when Russia's victory over the proxy state in Ukraine is admitted on the world stage, you will know that the capitulation has only just begun. The deep state controllers will gnash and whine and stamp their feet, all while their peoples suffer and try as they might to cast Russia as the engineer of said suffering, their masks will have slipped further as the truth becomes clear. Power is power, and whether they like it or not, Vladimir Putin wields it, and their would-be leaders do not. At this time, the narrative ground will be fertile for the third part in Putin's dialectic, since the deep states never got past the reaction phase. At this time, the villain himself will offer his own solution, not just for Russia, but for the world at large. A solution of sovereignty, and one built not on ink-stained ledgers and algorithms on flashing screens, nor emanating from the logos of three-letter networks the world over. This will be a sovereignty built on inherent strength and power, on will and oil, and finally, on gold. Putin has opened the door a crack, and in our next feature, we'll attempt to pry it open just a bit further and see what we can make of his plans, his solution to the problem, that is deep state control, and we'll see what we can glean of our own future in the process. You see, in the end, all sovereignty means is freedom, and all freedom means is the right to say no. By launching the opening salvo in a siege of a union that is representative of the rotten system that has enslaved would-be sovereign nations for decades, if not centuries, Russia is standing up for the first time in a long time. And she will not be the last to do so. In another life, a wise man once told me, in this world there are predators and there are prey. I used to struggle with this motif, as I'd been conditioned to see predators as evil, as inherently guilty in some way by virtue of being predators. But that is not what this man meant. After all, what better way to ward off a predator than to be one? What better way to keep from being hunted than to hunt? As my final digression into the realm of truth-telling in fiction and my closing of this piece, I'll leave you with a line from the genius that is True Detective Season 1. Quote, you wonder ever if you're a bad man? No, I don't wonder, Marty. World needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door. As we discussed in depth in part 4, The Death of War, every hero needs a good villain. See Vladimir Putin as that villain, if you want, but understand that he's helping to pave the path we're going down. And when you reach the end and look back to the road that brought you there, things might look a little different than you imagined. In Putin's mirrored dialectic, the problem and reaction phases may be nearly as unpleasant as the deep state's Hegelian version, as sometimes the old must be torn down before the new can be built in its place. But the solution phase will, in my view, represent the magician's turn, and a welcome one for sovereigns the world over. If you want a sneak peek at some of Donald Trump's plans for the United States petrodollar, the Federal Reserve banking system, and the underlying philosophy that will buoy the new economic world he intends to help usher in, watch the Russian master at work. For there will come a time when Putin the destroyer will be seen as Putin the builder. And if our own president in exile is known for one thing above all else, it is building. Russia is a prelude of things to come, and you're going to like how this movie ends. Stay tuned for Righteous Russia, Part 8.